Hey there. This week we are looking at the life of Hamilton. And today we're reviewing the book Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, by Ron Chernow. Ruben, how are you doing first?
I'm doing really well.
Good, good. Yeah, this book, it's a big book, a short audience. I think you have a copy as well. It's one of those big mamas. It's a big one. And it took us a while to read this, I think, right? And this is actually my second time going through it. The first time has been many years ago when it first came out. And so this book does a really good job. Now the writer, Ron Chernow, you could tell he's a fan of it, of Hamilton, because he paints him pretty much in a positive light on most of the book. Although he definitely gets into his issues that he had in life, and things that didn't make, some unwise choices Hamilton made. But that being said, I mean, for me overall, I really enjoyed the book. And I liked it. It does a really good job with his life in Charleston, Nevis, where he was born and where he was brought up. He was brought up in the Caribbean islands, right? And I enjoy that part because I didn't know anything about him before. Later on in the week, we're going to review the musical Hamilton, where you see a cast that is multiracial. And you know what? A lot of people from this island were from Africa. There were a lot of slaves, and Hamilton saw that as a child. And that really painted his idea of slavery in the future. And he was totally anti-slavery, which is one of the few people of our founding fathers that there was. I mean, Jefferson, Washington, Madison, they all had slaves. And we're not talking about 5 or 6 slaves. We're talking about hundreds of slaves, where Hamilton was always against it. And I think that was because of his upbringing. He had a tough upbringing. His parents, weren't married. His mother had a previous husband with a child, and she left him and had 2 children with Hamilton's father. And so it was a tough, being brought up that way in the Caribbean was not easy for him. And then when his mother died, he pretty much was an orphan and had to get by. So I thought that was, how do you feel about that, Ruben, regarding the beginning of the book where they deal with his life in the Caribbean? Did you know anything about that when you first read Hamilton?
I didn't, and as I read that, I find it remarkable that a founding father, as he's referred to now, not born here, he was disassociated through family and through country, and yet he ends up becoming who he is. So it's when I read this book, I don't know where to start with his accomplishments or with him as a person.
Yeah.
I will say, as terms of before I even get into that,
yeah.
What's remarkable to me is that the book is also focuses on Eliza Hamilton, his wife,
Yes.
as she attempts to rescue his legacy. So as it opens, we see a Hamilton who has largely been forgotten or even dismissed. But Eliza, at least during the lifetime of, subsequently, after Hamilton has passed away, Eliza lives to a very old age. He died when he was 49. We'll get to his death, which is one of the more dramatic things about his life. But it's really heartwarming to see this woman concerned about her husband's legacy as her and her whole family attempt to rescue it. And then you also wonder, I guess Chernow was also attempting the same thing. And as we know, he probably did it with a little help from the director and writer of Hamilton, the musical. And so, which we will review later this week. I want to say that he is a man, and you mentioned this, he is a man, as when we've talked, that has probably intuitively thinking, in terms of his intuition, perhaps he doesn't have much time on this earth. Now that might sound kind of morbid, I don't know, but we do know that he reads furiously as a child. He writes He's interested, and he becomes a voracious reader. He's interested in philosophy. In school, he forms a club that hones his writing, debating, speaking skills. He studies Locke, Hobbes, Hume, and Montesquieu. I do want to say, and then, I don't want to talk too much. So I just want to give the viewer a sense of who Hamilton is.
Right.
I want to say that I don't know if Montesquieu is even read today, but I actually am a fan of Montesquieu. Is Montesquieu read today in high school?
Sometimes I read, I might read it. I share pieces of his thinking because it does have an effect on our government regarding his philosophy on 3 branches of government and so forth.
Right.
So I think if kids hear about Montesquieu, it's in that line for sure.
I do want to say that because we are reviewing the Federalist Papers tomorrow, and I've been a fan of the Federalist Papers for a few years, but I think some people might go in wondering, well, how did the founding fathers develop their ideas?
Right.
And what I like about Montesquieu is he's fun to just read. He has these like aphorisms that are just real short that you can just sort of sit back and enjoy, but there's a lot of wisdom there. Yeah. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read just a few.
Oh, no, please.
Here's just a few. So he's a French philosopher, 1700s. To become truly great, one has to stand with people, not above them. There is no greater tyranny than that which is perpetrated under the shield of the law and in the name of justice. Think about that one. The tyranny of a prince in an oligarchy is not so dangerous to the public welfare as the apathy of a citizen in a democracy. I like this next one. I've never known any trouble that an hour's reading did not relieve. Success, yeah, that's pretty good. Success in the majority of circumstances depends on knowing how long it takes to succeed. I'm going to give you just 2 more.
They're good, man.
Liberty is the right of doing whatever the laws permit. And then this was kind of fun. An author is a fool who, not content with boring those he lives with, insists on boring future generations. So I share that because these founding fathers, especially Hamilton, really were in touch with great philosophers, were well read. And one thing that I saw in Hamilton, before we get to his accomplishments,
sure,
was this his structure in writing essays, or his strategy in writing essays. He would speak them first. He would walk and just speak his passions. And then he would start to formulate what he was going to write. Then he'd sit down and write out after he spoke it.
Yeah. The
reason I think that's pretty critical and informative is that as I reflected on that, I think, well, maybe I should do that. I think I've decided to no longer give essays on things that I care about or the things that I think the students should write about. I think they should write what they are passionate about. Mm-hmm. And some of them might need help with that because some students don't have very many passions maybe, or need support in that type of thing. But it's the Hamiltonian way. And I think it's the right approach.
Yeah. I mean, as you share that, I think about, especially when you went into Montesquieu and Locke and all these people that he read, Rousseau, it was a little different between him and the other founding fathers, where most of them came from privilege. He didn't. He sought out those books. He saw people having them, and he would ask to read those. And so that's what made him a little bit more special in my mind. Of course, I'm a little biased. I've read biographies on all these guys, and this one kind of sticks, and I could see why, as you shared the musical Lin-Manuel, why it stuck with him, because he's just a fascinating individual. Just because he was born in the Caribbean and how he rose up. But yeah, I think as the book goes on, Ruben, where you see him as a young man, he's like 16 years old when he gets to America. He goes to, he's thinking about going to Princeton. That's where he first meets Aaron Burr, right? Some mutual friends, and Burr went to Princeton as a 13-year-old. And then so Hamilton decides eventually to go to King's College in New York, right? And he gets about 3 years of his education done, but then guess what happens? The American Revolution gets involved, and I think Chernow does a good job regarding Hamilton, how he was just, it's like he wants to prove himself he's American, you know. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fight, and I'm going to lead. And he eventually steals some cannons from the British, right? That's kind of one of his victories, or people, they know that he did that in New York. And if you ever go to New York City, you see the area where these cannons were stationed, and that's where Hamilton, stole them and gave them to the rebels, right? The Americans, or the colonists at the time they were called. But that being said, you paint him as this. He painted him as this fighter, and he ends up, because of his reputation, ends up being with Washington as the aide de camp, right? He goes and he works for him, and he becomes he corresponds for Washington, right? He also becomes somebody who sends messages, right? A courier. And that's actually where he meets his wife. He sends a message from Washington to Eliza Schuyler's father, right?
I just want to point something out, because back to what you were mentioning with Washington, and then the idea that he's from someplace else other than America. He's not from privilege, in contrast with other founding fathers.
Right.
One of the reasons I see that he has decided to really champion the idea of meritocracy, Chernow points out, is because of the passing over, the consistent passing him over by Washington, and that really frustrated Hamilton. And I want to say, if I learned nothing else from this book, the most important thing is that Hamilton never quit asking. So this is critical, because a lot of us hear no, and we program ourselves to think, well, then it's no. But that wasn't the case with Hamilton. He kept asking Washington for a military appointment, and no was not good enough. And it made him more driven and motivated to get that appointment until he finally did. And
and you know what? I'm glad you brought that up.
Continue forward his mission to believe in the faulty ideas of aristocracy. So this is part. So I see that as failure helping him ultimately to be successful.
Right, and that actually hurt his relationship with Washington at that time in his life, because he kept pushing, and he finally got it. And Washington finally said, "Okay, take this commission." He he's commissioned as a colonel, and later in his life, he's called Colonel Hamilton, and Hamilton likes being called Colonel Hamilton because he fought in the American Revolution. He has that's a badge of honor, and he wears it proudly throughout his life. And so to be that, and to be part of the Yorktown, as Yorktown falls, the British not only retreat, but they give their arms to Hamilton and to Washington. He was part of that. And so that everyone in America knew him. So now this is where he's getting renowned, known, and he goes into, back to New York, because that's where his station is throughout his life. He's a New York guy. Okay. I'm not sure if everyone knows that's where he spent most of his life. But, and I think Chernow does a really good job with getting that feel of New York at that time, right? It was very, it was definitely contrast to the South, where it was more agrarian. New York was more industrial, right? And so you get that feel. But yeah, so go ahead, Ruben.
So with the military appointment, think about Hamilton now in terms of how many people are this great of a thinker, a philosopher, who could write the Federalist Papers. Around 50 of them were his, out of the, I think, 78 total.
85,
85. And so he defended the Constitution. He defended the ideals here. He also was a military hero. In the Battle of Yorktown, so I'm going to also give him a little bit of a critique in a way. But before I do, there is this romance that people have of the French Revolution, because it perhaps was happening right after the American Revolution, and this idea that, well, the French helped us, therefore it's the same thing. Maybe people think that they use some of the same verbiage, liberty, revolution, so they're very similar. But this romance continues to this day with some people of the French Revolution, and Hamilton fought against that. He said it from the beginning, and it wasn't until later that Jefferson noticed maybe Hamilton had a point here with the lopping off of all these heads, and the violence and the bloodshed that kept going, not just of politicians and kings, but of children, right? So
yeah.
I do want to point out, though, that Battle of Yorktown also took the lives of a lot of Frenchmen who died with American patriots, and people forget that part of history. But there's, I like how they bring up Lafayette, and he was a hero as well, and barely escaped with his life, and when he went back to France. So perhaps my only critique there of Hamilton is that he was too hard on France. He had forgotten that, France also helped us in the war.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. And I think he knows this. I mean, he speaks highly of his friend, Lafayette. He actually had a really good friend in the war named John Lawrence, who looked a lot like him, actually, right? And some people in history have painted them as maybe possible lovers. There just isn't really enough documentation for that, just because it's the way people wrote to each other, really loving, if like a sweetheart in a way, but at times those letters were more about just friendship and camaraderie, right? So he met a lot of cool people and a lot of these people helped him with his career. So when he went back to New York, he was ready. He started his law practice, but he got into politics right away, becoming a congressman for New York under the Articles of Confederation, right under our first Constitution. And then later he was part of the first Bank of New York. So he helped establish that. So he's getting his name renowned, and then he gets invited to the Constitutional Convention, which they didn't call it that, but we caught that later on. But it was in Philadelphia, where they totally threw out the Articles of Confederation and wrote a new document in secret, and it became the Constitution. And he was part of the founders who signed his name to it. And he then later defended it, right, Ruben, with all these Federalist Papers that you mentioned. He wrote like 51 of them. Well, go ahead.
For those, many viewers might not understand, though, what was at stake, or might not remember what was going on. At least it's been a long time, maybe in history, past for a lot of us. But he was dealing with a paradox that I think still exists today. That is a question that many people struggle with, and that is his continual optimism for America, but also his distrust for humans often, and the frailties. And how do you create a society that balances between despotism and anarchy? It is a real challenge. So this was the fight he had with Jefferson, and it was a long battle, and
kind of a funny battle if you think about it, because Jefferson was an aristocrat in a way, right? I mean, he has over 200 slaves, and he had a life of privilege where Hamilton didn't, and he painted Hamilton as the aristocrat, as the out of touch, right?
Yeah, and he did, and he was always championing the idea of the individual states and the liberties of the state.
People.
Yeah, Jefferson did, but Hamilton, it wasn't as if he didn't appreciate the value of the states. Is that, how do we keep this union together? How do we not have these individual states go rogue to the point of lawlessness? So Hamilton was very interested. Here's the philosophy part, and here's the influence of Locke, Hume, is this idea that, wait a minute, we also could really devolve here into every man for himself. How do we uphold liberty and law? That is really hard. And, in the musical that we are going to see later on in the week, I think Washington reminds him, hey, it's easy to die on the revolutionary battlefield. It's much harder to rule and to live and to rule and to govern. So he's battling a really big question and paradox here, isn't he?
And you got to remember that, and then you mentioned it, that, state rights was very important to the colonists. And then when they become their own country, they create the Articles of Confederation, which was really strong in state rights. So and it was the Constitution was written when Jefferson was in France. Madison was there in Virginia, which is funny because later on he's an advocate for state rights, but at that time he was pushing for a strong central government. And
Who's he?
Madison. Madison was at that time, regarding when the Constitution was being written, because he's considered the father of our Constitution, James Madison, because he wrote it, right? He was the note taker at the convention, but he wrote the document. And so, but as that's being written, it's really bringing in the idea that, hey, we need, like you said, we need a strong central government. We just had this other document that really didn't help this country come together. But this is a document that does give states power, right, but the federal government is going to be the overseer, and it's the number one power of the country, and it still is today. And there still is that dialogue, right, between the parties today. It's funny now, the Republican Party is more for state rights, and Democrat is more for stronger central government. I would say, as some people might argue with that, but I would say in most cases. But so going back to the book, the Federalist Papers were written. They were successful because in the end, they got they only needed 9 states to approve it, and New York, I believe, becomes the last state, the 9th state to approve it. I might be wrong; it might have been Virginia, but I think it was New York. And boom, it becomes the law of the land. And so then I found the interesting part of the book written is when Washington is looking for his cabinet after this, right? Because he's basically picked as the next president. Everyone loves Washington. He was the hero of the Revolution, and Washington's looking for people. He knows he's probably gonna get Jefferson as Secretary of State. He has to bring him back from France, and you know what? Who is he gonna get as Secretary of the Treasury? And in the book, it seems like he doesn't know. He talks to Governor Morris, who is he's possibly somebody who might be in that position. And Morris goes, you know what? Why not Hamilton? And Washington's like, Hamilton? I didn't know he was involved. He knew much about finances. Oh my God, he's probably the number one in the country in that area. He knows a lot about finances. And then Washington goes, okay. And so I just thought it was interesting. I never knew that. I mean, Washington, he was around this guy for 5-6 years, and then finally he picks him to be his Secretary of Treasury, which I thought was interesting.
I think he also became a quick study. He hadn't been up until that point, but he sought out a friend who knew business matters. And I think that it led eventually to his compromise with Jefferson and Madison in terms of what are we going to do about this idea of Jefferson does not want the states or the government to take on state debt and so forth. And he decides to compromise with Hamilton if they move the capital to DC, right?
And that was a big secret compromise, to DC.
And so, but really Hamilton, I think, came out ahead on that one. And it's part of the story that I think was good, and a kind of a coalescing, coming together between the two parties, which I thought was cool.
And it shows that go ahead.
Go on.
I was saying, it shows that Washington knew he had these different opinions, these guys who had different opinions, and he'd like to hear both sides. And he would sometimes go with Jefferson's ideas and sometimes Hamilton. As his tenure went, from his first tenure to the second one, he started relying more to Hamilton, right? But he definitely listened to both sides, and he thought it was a great thing. I think the only 2 times in history maybe there were difference of opinions like that was under Washington and later on Lincoln. But these 2 guys definitely saw things apart, and that because of their differences, we got the first two political parties, the Federalists and the Democrats/Republicans. But they definitely didn't see eye to eye, those guys. And I think Chernow definitely shows that, how they were definitely complaining about each other behind the scenes and talking about each other.
There's a moment that is pretty interesting Washington quelling a growing riot by reminding the people don't forget about your loyalty to our country and to the revolution. I'm losing my eyesight and my ailments from the revolution. He really used persuasion, and Hamilton took note of that and was reminded that it's better to stem a torrent than to divert it. And those little things are really critical to the success of Washington, and really showed how wise he is and why he developed a great loyalty. And I think the reader would probably read this and then want to read a biography on Washington, because he's really obviously a towering figure in this book and in Hamilton's life. I do want to mention this little bit, I should say here, about the religion of Hamilton. And it says, Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson possibly influenced Hamilton in that they were followers of deism, possibly, which sought to substitute reason for revelation and drop the idea of God intervening in human affairs. Now, let me ask you this question. You, a person of faith, as am I, is there anything wrong with what this concept is? This idea of dropping revelation in favor of reason and saying that God doesn't necessarily intervene in human affairs? And then let me just add this to it, to that question. Isn't it probably the reason why these guys were so successful in the building of America, that they did not believe in special revelation? Instead, they believed in fixed principles that were the foundation of the Constitution, and not on somebody coming in and saying, God spoke to me, and this is what he told me today. So what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with their ideas of God?
It's interesting that you share that, because this is a time period where you're going from a time where people relied more on, what the church was telling them, right? With these revelations, to a time of reason, to a time of scientific discovery. And almost all the founding fathers were probably deist. And Hamilton, I would say he evolved over time. His wife was she was very religious. She's a Christian woman, but I would say, and she definitely had influence on Hamilton. But at this time, as a young man, what we're talking about right now, yeah, I think definitely there's nothing wrong with thinking, hey, you know what? I need to look at what the problems are before me, getting this country together. And I don't think it's wrong to be able to use your mind for it. I think that's what you're sharing, right, Ruben?
I'm asking your opinion.
Yeah.
What do you think of this concept of saying it's not revelation, it's reason over that? God doesn't speak to you. What's more important is the fixed principles over your revelation, and this idea that God doesn't intervene in human affairs.
Yeah. As a personal thing, I don't agree with it personally. However, is it wrong that these people, that's their mindset? No.
That's too easy. Too easy.
I just said,
I'm asking you your opinion. You're saying you don't agree with it.
Not all of it. Meaning,
and to me, I would say,
yeah,
not only should you agree with it, you should say if they didn't agree with it, I'm not sure if we'd even have a country.
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Because it's either revelation or it's fixed principles. There is no revelation.
I think you have both. I think you could man it that way, and people have, and I think he did as he got older in life. And I think he came to terms with that, because he Chernow shares that he does go back to his religion of his youth, and his wife definitely had an influence on him as well. But at the time, as the founding is happening, as the government is being structured, he's relying on his. I think
there's something that we're missing here, or I think we're talking past each other. I'm not saying he didn't believe in Jesus Christ. I think they all did. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is a concept that I think still pervades today in the church, not everybody,
Right.
where somebody says, God spoke to me.
Right.
Whereas a Hamilton or maybe a Ben Franklin would say, no, he didn't. He's already spoken.
I get you. I agree with you then. Yeah, I think that, and I don't want to go into it, theology right now, but I would say, I hear you now. And I say, yeah, it makes sense that they would say,
I think it's very critical.
Revelation. Let's go with, yeah.
I think it's enormously critical to to the founding of the country, because you're talking about people who are kind of bringing through them, channeling through them, thousands of years of philosophy,
right?
And
yeah,
philosophers, and thinkers, right. As opposed to, what did God tell you? Which people do in different forms.
They still do that today. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that can be scary if it's not, obviously backed up by scripture. But that being said, yeah, I hear you. And I think that was a strength of the founding fathers, correct? And they did speak of their faith. And a lot of their documents have God and their faith is revealed there. But yeah, so that's interesting. Good point, Ruben.
Thank you. The other thing is, I guess we could start talking about the idea of how he passed and what went on in that. But I do want to really talk or mention this concept though of the continuity of monarchy. His idea, or his maybe obsession, was the idea of how do you have the continuity of a monarchy with the liberties of a republic. And I've always thought it was fascinating that the French Revolution happened right around the same time.
Yeah.
And to me, it's always been a mystery, sort of. I mean, you could read books about it and you get ideas as to why the French Revolution went so far awry. But here's after reading this book, you get a little bit more clues.
Sure.
But at one point, Hamilton mentions that absolute disgust with the French Revolution from the very beginning. So he saw beyond even Jefferson, who went there. Hamilton didn't even go there. He already can see things. Very wise man. But he also mentioned to somebody, it might have been Lafayette. I think it was Lafayette. He said that one thing that he notices is in the character of those of the people at that time. The reason why Hamilton was seeing things that way is because for some reason the people of France were not either ready for it or they were in the wrong mindset. He was talking about the character of France and the times, besides the ideas. So it is intriguing because I think Hamilton was using the wisdom of what he knew of the American character, where for some reason, even though it still was a struggle, it seemed he was mostly optimistic that it could work in America, but he was pessimistic about what was happening in France. Yeah. So there was an interesting passage along those lines.
No, that's interesting because, I mean, we could have definitely, I think if Jefferson had his way, we would have got into it, and it could have been a different story. It could have been definitely bloodier for us, the United States, and who knows if we could have survived it. I think Washington was wise to be neutral to that, and we're better for it. I will share as we get towards the end here of the book. Hamilton wasn't perfect. One of his issues is that throughout his life, he is trying to, I don't want to say shed his past, his upbringing, but he knows he's different than the rest. I mean, he doesn't talk a lot about his childhood in the Caribbean. He, in some instances, I think he even makes up some of his past. And so that because of that, I think he gets himself into trouble when people put him down. So he doesn't let things go. If you're going to knock his character, he is fighting you verbally. He'll write even using pseudonyms in a paper to talk back about somebody else. John Adams, when he was president, spoke badly about him, called him a Creole. And he Hamilton was going to take that. He was going to speak back. And then when he was running for president again in 1800, Hamilton didn't support a Federalist, which he was a Federalist. He'd rather back up his enemy Jefferson than do that. So I think that was one of the things that really brought him down, was that he just couldn't keep quiet when people talked bad about him. He had to speak up. And I think even his son had that issue as well. But I don't know. What do you think about that, Ruben?
So that leads to the end.
Yeah, it does.
His end.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. You say, what do I think of that? I guess, I mean, of course, I agree that he probably should have, I don't know, chose different words to
Sure.
describe Aaron Burr. There was a thing that Chernow does that kind of creates these parallel lives of these two men, and that resulted in a collision at the end. I guess my question to you is that Hamilton, the ending where he duels Aaron Burr and dies, was that his way of suicide, or did he think this was going to end in a different way, where he would win or he would walk away? What do you think?
Wow, I never thought about that. And I could see maybe the arguments that maybe it was suicide, because he wrote letters before he died, before he went on that not battlefield, but that duel where he met. I think they actually dueled in New Jersey, right? But he wrote letters to people and talking about the situation, right? And talking about his what was going to happen and what he wished. So maybe this was a suicide. I never thought of that. I don't really truly believe that, because he also was talking about writing books and being an influence there about the history of the country, even history of the world. And so he definitely had some more in him, and he was a prolific writer, and he was a good writer. And that being said, I just can't believe that he would do that, because he did have like 7 children that were still alive. He and his wife had 8 kids, and to leave her that way. And he did, he left her in a tough way. She had to, survive it. And she did, but it was difficult for her in the beginning after he passed away. So I can't really believe that he did that just because of his character. He seemed like he was really in tune with his children and his wife in the last few years of his life. And then maybe I'm just being too emotional about it, Ruben, because I could be that way, but I just
no. You emotional?
I know. It's a surprise. But yeah,
for me,
I deserve that sarcasm.
I would say that for the viewer who doesn't know, his son had just died in similar fashion in a duel, and he lost, and he was killed.
Same gun, same place.
I would say, based on the advice of his father, Alexander Hamilton told him to throw the gun in the air, to not shoot, to be a gentleman about it. And this other person, Eckhart, I think his name was, they had a little skirmish over Alexander Hamilton, and the person had said, Eckhart had given some derogatory comments. Philip Hamilton didn't like it. They dueled. Before they dueled, Alexander Hamilton gave very bad advice. Throw the gun away. Assuming that Eckhart would, throw the gun away as well? Well, he didn't throw the gun away. He shot him dead. And the result of this just blunder on Hamilton's part. By the way, we didn't talk about the affair.
Big part, I know.
Alexander Hamilton had an affair, which could have resulted in his ruin, but it didn't.
It didn't help him. He could have been president. It did hurt him.
It hurt him, and that's true. And so Hamilton made some mistakes, that being one of them, and he was really covering up that mistake. Luckily, it didn't involve embezzlement, which was the original thought when they were starting to uncover his misdeed, but it was an ongoing affair. So Philip dies, and as a result of this duel, bad advice from Hamilton. There's another child, a younger daughter, just about a year younger than Philip, who was absolutely devastated and pretty much lost her mind from the death of her older brother. The death of her older brother over Hamilton's, the duel happened over Hamilton, and the death happened from Hamilton's advice.
Yeah.
What do I say about this? I don't know, but in my opinion, it was a suicide.
Whoa.
And it was a suicide in the sense that he could never commit suicide. Alexander Hamilton could never do that because it's dishonorable. There's many reasons why he can't literally do that, hit by his own hand. However, I mean, come on. It's like he knew Aaron Burr was a good shot. He threw the gun away.
Actually, Aaron Burr was a bad shot. He just practiced before. Hamilton was a good shot. Yeah.
Well, all of his friends were saying he was an excellent shot.
Okay.
So he practiced it.
He practiced, definitely. He practiced
to be a good shot.
He did.
But was he known to be a bad shot? That I didn't read.
He was known to be a bad shot.
That I didn't read. Okay, so I didn't.
The weeds, I'm sorry.
I missed that. So, okay. I'll tell you what, if you're a bad shot and you're throwing a gun away, you're still might get hit. You still have a very good chance of not winning that duel, right?
For sure.
So
yes.
my thought is that, and that I think he was at the point in his life where there was just heartache after heartache. He had not much of a career left, and he was a lion in winter. He was gonna be 50 soon, and what did he have? Yes, he had children he loved. That's just my thought.
No, that's fair. Yeah, I mean, as you share that, I had some thoughts as well, but I think we'll leave it there because it's a good debate. I didn't even thought about that before, but you brought up some good arguments. But I guess we'll never know. He definitely had a wonderful wife who, as the author shared, lived another 50 years. She started the first orphanage in New York, and she had a heart for it because she married an orphan. And I think she knew that he would love that. And they took in a couple kids while with having a brood of 8 children, So these are people who love kids, and what a wonderful life though, Ruben. I think we're better because Hamilton lived, and I think Chernow did a good job with that. We, just like Truman, when McCullough wrote the book on Truman a few years ago, Truman was never considered one of the top 5 presidents of all time. He is now because of that book. And I think if this book wasn't written about Hamilton, A, we wouldn't have the musical that we just, B, he'd be off the $10 bill, and just nobody would know him. I feel like every few generations, Hamilton comes back up, because in the 1800s, Hamilton's wife, Eliza, she made sure he wasn't forgotten. But then you got a long lull of people not talking about him until 2000, really. And then now, boom, he's remembered. And thank God he is, because he definitely brought something to the table. And I think he's one of our great founding fathers. Ruben, before we take off, I think you're the one. Wow, what do you think? Anything else you want to share regarding this great man?
No, I will never spend a $10 bill again the same. Lot to be appreciative of this man, and read the book by Ron Chernow.
Excellent. Okay, then. You guys have a good night. Bye-bye.